Some places don't feel strange because of what people say about them. They feel different because of what actually happened there. No embellishment, no need to add anything. Just history sitting where it's always been. Tonight, on the Midnight Drive, we continue through Nebraska. We're heading northwest into a stretch of land that saw conflict, confinement, and an ending that didn't come quietly. And then, further south, a house built to last, a life that didn't, and a pattern that never fully resolved. After all, some places don't need stories because they already have them. See, Fort Robinson doesn't need a legend. It already has a history that's difficult enough to sit with on its own. Located in the Pine Ridge region of northwestern Nebraska, the land carries a kind of presence that people notice before they even understand why. Open space, bluffs, wind that doesn't really stop, and underneath all of it, layer after layer of events that didn't play out cleanly. See, the fort itself was established in the 1870s. At the time, it wasn't meant to be symbolic. It was practical. A military post near the Red Cloud Agency, where thousands of Native Americans were being managed, supplied, and controlled under federal oversight. Tensions were already high. Corruption in the agency system, broken agreements, encroachment on land that had already been negotiated, in the presence of the Army, didn't resolve any of that tension. It concentrated it. Fort Robinson became a place where things came to a head. In 1877, one of the most well-known figures of the Plains War was brought there. Crazy Horse, a leader, a symbol, and someone who had already surrendered under uncertain terms. Accounts differ on what happened next, but what is consistent is how it all ended. He was taken to a guardhouse. There was resistance, a struggle, and then a soldier drove a bayonet into his body. He died shortly after. Not in battle, not on open ground, but inside a confined space. There's a marker at that site now. Simple, direct, no interpretation, just the acknowledgement that it happened there. And even without any added meaning, that's enough to change how a place feels. But that wasn't the only event tied to the fort. 2 years later, something happened that left an even deeper mark. A group of North Cheyenne had been forced south to a reservation in Indian Territory. The conditions were poor. Food was limited, the land unfamiliar, and many of them made a decision. They would leave. They would return north, back toward their home. It wasn't a quiet journey, and there were conflicts along the way. Eventually, part of the group, led by Chief Dullknife, was captured near Fort Robinson. They were brought in, held, and told they would be sent back south. They refused, not as a negotiation, as a final decision. They would rather die than return. What followed wasn't immediate. It stretched out. Pressure, orders, and then punishment. They were confined to barracks, cut off from food, from heat in the middle of winter. The idea was simple: force compliance. Break them down until they agreed to go back. But that didn't happen. Instead, they made another decision. On January 9th, 1879, they broke out. About 150 people, men, women, children, moving into the night, on foot, in the snow, trying to reach the hills, trying to get away. What followed wasn't a chase in the way people usually imagine it. It was systematic. Soldiers pursuing them across open ground. Engagements over the next several days. People being caught, wounded, killed. Some were brought back, others continued to run, until there was nowhere left to go. By late January, the remaining group was cornered, outnumbered, poorly armed, and most of them were killed where they stood. Dozens dead, others wounded. A handful surviving long enough to be taken back again, and a small number escaping entirely. The numbers vary depending on the account, but the outcome doesn't. It ended right there, on that land. And unlike the stories from earlier in the week, this isn't something that gets debated as legend. It's documented, written about, reported at the time, even criticized publicly for how it was handled. And that's where the tone shifts. Because when you stand in a place like that, you're not wondering if something happened. You're standing where it did happen. Visitors today describe the area as peaceful, scenic, even quiet. The buildings are still there. They're restored. They're maintained. People even stay there overnight. They walk the grounds. They take in the landscape. But there are also reports that there are voices on the wind, sounds that don't match the present moment. Wagons, horses, commands carried across open space. Figures seen near the old structures. Movement where there shouldn't be any. Those reports aren't consistent, and they don't happen for everyone. And they're not necessary to understand the place, because the weight is already there. It's built into the ground, into the buildings, into the sequence of events that unfolded there. And maybe that's what people are actually responding to. Not something supernatural, but something that doesn't fully settle. A place where the past didn't end cleanly. Where decisions were made that didn't resolve. And where the consequences of those decisions still feel very present. Not in a way that you can prove, but in a way that's difficult to ignore. Because sometimes the history is enough. Have you ever been out to these open plains? Have you ever spent time at Fort Robinson? Would you spend time at Fort Robinson? Let us know in the comments below. If you have something that you'd like to share with us and leave us a message, go ahead and give us a ring at the Midnight Drive at 402-610-2836. You're listening to The Midnight Drive. From Fort Robinson, you carry something with you. Not a story, not speculation, just a weight. And as you move further south toward North Platte, that weight doesn't disappear. It changes, becomes quieter, and less immediate. But it's still there. Scouts Rest Ranch sits just outside of town. Open land, wide sky. The kind of place that was meant to feel expansive. Built in the late 1800s by William F. Cody, better known as Buffalo Bill. A name that became larger than the person. Frontier scout, buffalo hunter, showman. Someone who didn't just live through the American West, but helped define how it would be remembered. The house itself reflects that. It's large. It was carefully designed. At the time, it was one of the most prominent homes in the area. People called it the Mansion on the Prairie. Not because it was excessive, but because of where it was. A structure like that set against open land tends to stand out. And maybe that's where the feeling begins. Not in anything that happened in the house, but in the contrast, a life that moved constantly and then suddenly stopped. Buffalo Bill traveled extensively. He performed. He built a reputation that crossed continents. But this was where he returned, where things slowed down, where the public version of his life gave way to something more private. And places like that tend to hold something different. It's not intensity, it's not violence, it's just presence. There aren't widely documented reports of hauntings here. No single event that defines the property the way Fort Robinson is defined. No moment you can point to and say, this is where everything changed. But that doesn't mean that people haven't noticed things. There have definitely been investigations there. Groups moving through the house at night, trying to document something. Anything that stands out from the ordinary. Some of what they've reported is very easy to dismiss. A rope moving in a still room. A sensation of something tugging at clothing. Audio that seems to form words. If you're already listening for them. See, if you're expecting it, you're going to hear it. And most of the time, those things can be explained away. Old structures settle. Air shifts. Sound carries in ways that people aren't expecting. And it doesn't always make sense to them. That's the reality of places like this. But occasionally, something doesn't line up quite right. Motion detectors triggered in empty rooms. A rocking chair moving slightly. Without a clear cause. Footsteps where nobody is walking. It's never dramatic, and it's not consistent. But it's enough that people keep mentioning it. And that's where it becomes worth paying attention to. Not because it proves anything, but because it shows a pattern. A quiet pattern. The kind that doesn't demand belief, just observation. There are also stories that never quite fit into the house itself. Accounts of figures near the barn. A man seen standing in the doorway or watching from the upper level. In one story in particular that comes up more than once, a young worker, a laborer, someone who died there under unclear circumstances. Some say it was an accident, others, something else. The detail changes depending on who tells it. But the image stays the same. A figure in the barn. Not moving much. He's just there. Again, no documentation that confirms it. no record that ties it cleanly to the history of the place. But it persists. And that persistence matters because it points to something beyond the property itself, something tied to the time that it came from. The late 1800s weren't just defined by expansion. They were defined by isolation, people living far apart, long stretches of land with very little human presence, days that passed without conversation, nights that were completely dark, no electricity, no constant noise, just the wind and the animals, and whatever your mind did with the silence. And that kind of environment changes people. It sharpens awareness, but it also fills space. When there's nothing around you, your brain starts to create structure, meaning, presence, even when there isn't anything there to confirm it. That's where a lot of these stories begin. We've talked about this countless times here on the show. These stories aren't deliberate inventions, but they're interpretations. It's something that somebody felt. It's something that they heard. Something that didn't immediately make sense. And over time, those moments get shared. They're interesting. They get retold. And then they get adjusted slightly with each version that gets told until they settle into something recognizable. A ghost, a presence, a figure that belongs to the place. Cowboy culture in particular carried a lot of that with it. Long rides, long nights, men spending days or weeks without seeing another person. Stories became a way of grounding that experience, of giving shape to something that would feel otherwise too open, too undefined. And when those stories attach to a place, they don't leave easily. Scouts Rest Ranch sits right at the intersection of that. It's a real place with real history, and a figure who became something larger than life itself. Buffalo Bill wasn't just a person. He was a narrative, a version of the West that people could understand. Controlled, packaged, presented. But behind that, there was still the land. There was still the quiet. There were still the parts that didn't fit nicely and neatly into the story. And maybe that's what people feel when they visit. It's not something supernatural, but rather something unresolved. The gap between the story that was told and the reality that existed underneath it. Because places like this don't just hold events, they hold identity. And when that identity is as large as Buffalo Bill's, it doesn't fade easily, even after the person is long gone. So you walk through the house, you see the rooms, the furniture, the details that have been preserved. And everything feels still, exactly as it should. Which begs the question, is this place actually haunted? Or like so many cowboys on the open range, has your mind assigned a story to this place? That's for you to decide.